Well, congratulations. You made it to the final chapter of the grammar that we are going to cover in this class. Chapter 29 of the First Hebrew Primer. So this is our last vocabulary list for Hebrew grammar. Let's look at the upper right. Of course, you know, you're very familiar with this verb, halak, which means to walk. We're going to cover the hitpael stem this week, and in the hitpael stem, that verb means to go back and forth, kind of an iterative idea. Halal means to praise in the piel stem. In the hitpael stem, it means to boast. Chazak means to be strong in the kal stem or the paal stem. In the hifil stem, it means to strengthen or grasp, right, to cause to be strong. And in the hitpael stem, it means to strengthen oneself. Then there's the verb chara, which means to burn in the kal stem. In the upper left, we have avad, which means to work, serve, or worship. Palal in the hitpael stem means to pray. Kadash in the piel stem means to sanctify. In the hifil stem, it means to cause to be holy. And in the hitpael stem, it means to make oneself holy. So you can see the differences in the verb patterns there and how they affect the meaning. And then af means anger or nose. And that's regularly used in an idiom with this word to burn down here, chara. When someone's nose becomes hot, their af becomes chara. That means they're angry. And that's typically how English translations will translate that. Yahweh's nose was hot means Yahweh is angry. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the stem values. You're familiar with this XY chart here by now. And these verbal stems or verb patterns record two things: the type of action, which we can see along the top horizontal axis there, simple, causative, or intensive. And you can see the hitpael stem is mostly intensive action. And then it also records verbal voice, and the hitpael is the reflexive voice. That is where the subject both does the verb and receives the and is the object of the verb as well. There's four primary meanings of the hitpael stem. The first is this intensive or reflexive idea. Intensive reflexive idea. And that is the most common. That's where the subject, it's basically the same meaning of the verb as the piel stem has for it, but it's reflexive. So you can see that example there, hit kadesh, means to sanctify himself. Instead of just to sanctify, it means to sanctify oneself, or he sanctified himself. It can mean reciprocal if it's got a plural subject. Like here's from the verb ra'ah, to see. Hit ra'u means they looked at each other. They were looking at each other. So it's a reciprocal idea with a plural subject. It can communicate an iterative idea. That is like to do something over and over and over again. Like the verb halak in the hitpael stem, hit halech, means to walk back and forth or to pace. And then finally, there are some verbs in the hitpael stem that just have a simple action meaning, like the verb palal, which means to pray. Okay, so let's take a look at how to recognize a hitpael pattern verb. First, the hitpael pattern is easily recognized by this infixed tav. You have a hey tav prefix. In the imperfect, you have the signal letter that will replace the hey, but that infixed tav is going to be there all the way through the different verbal conjugations. So that's helpful. In the participle form, the root is preceded by mit. Again, you have that infixed tav with the prefix mem tav. In the imperfect, again, you still have that infixed tav. Before that infixed tav, you have the signal letters of the imperfect. The second root letter has a dagesh unless it's one of the 5 guttural letters. So the second root letter, just like the piel stem, is going to have a dagesh in it. The exact spelling of each of these verbs you can see in the spelling charts in the textbook, and then we're going to look at some of these charts that communicate how to do it as well. Now here is a list of the top 10 verbs in the hitpael stem in the Hebrew Bible. The most common is palal, which means to pray, which has a simple action meaning, and that only occurs in the hitpael stem. Halak, we just talked about, has an iterative idea in the hitpael stem, means to walk back and forth. Yatsav in the hitpael stem means to take your stand, to stand firm. There is a hit pile stem of the verb nava, which means to prophesy, and it means to speak or behave as a prophet. Chazak in the hit pile stem means to strengthen oneself. You get that reflexive idea. We've already looked at kadash. Halal we looked at as well as one of our vocab words, means to boast. Taher in the hit pile stem means to cleanse oneself or to purify oneself. Yachas in the hit pile stem means to be registered in a genealogical list. That's kind of an unusual word. We've certainly not had that as a vocabulary word. And then aval means to observe mourning rites in the hit pile stem. So those are the 10 most common verbs in the Hebrew Bible in the hit pile stem. Okay, let's look at the perfect strong verb paradigm, the hit pile perfect paradigm. You can see the kal or the pile stem on the left-hand side. And like all perfects, how do we know it's a perfect? Because of the endings, right? The atatati utentenu ending. How do you know it's a hit pile? Well, it's got that hey tab prefix and a dagesh forte in the second root consonant. So the hit pile is actually one of the easiest verbal stems to identify. Let me just read a couple of these. I won't read all of them, but the third masculine singular is hitkatel, hitkatala, hitkatalta, hitkatali. So you can hear that hit at the beginning and then the endings of the perfect. And of course you translate it as a perfect as completed action. Normally it's a past tense and it's got that reflexive idea normally as well. In the imperfect, it has the same signal letters as a regular imperfect, so we're used to seeing that. However, the difference is there is this infixed tav all the way through in every form, and then a dagesh forte in the second root consonant. Hitkatel, tikkatel, tikkatel, tikkatali. So you can hear that as you go all the way through the paradigm. Again, one of the easiest verb patterns to recognize. Is translated like an imperfect normally is, as a present future tense or modally or as adjussive. And it's got typically that reflexive idea behind it. The imperative. This is very similar to the nifal stem where you chop off the prefix of the imperfect and then a hey takes its place. And you translate it like an imperative and it's got that reflexive idea. So you have hitkatel, hitkatali, hitkatalu, and so on. The infinitive has the regular infinitive, which is right below me here on the screen, hitkatel, which looks just like a 2ms imperative, which is true in most verb patterns. So you're going to have to look at context for the difference. And of course, the infinitive, regular infinitive or infinitive construct will regularly have a prepositional prefix. And then you have the hit pile infinitive absolute form, which is the same. There's actually no difference in this stem between those two forms. The participle has a mem tab prefix with the endings of the participle. So again, very easy to recognize the hit pile participle. Now, there are a couple of things to note with the hit pile stem. The first is there's a strange thing that can happen called metathesis. And what that means is when you have that hetab prefix that connects to a verbal root that begins with a sibilant letter, like any S-sounding letter, like a samek, a tzare, a sin, or a sheen. So when you have a hit prefix attached to a verbal root that begins with an S-sounding letter, the tav and the S letter switch places, and that's called metathesis. So you can see this first example here, it's a pretty common verb. Satar means to hide. It normally occurs in the hit pile stem, and when it does, you see that hit prefix is attached, but the samek and the tav have switched places, and that's called metathesis. And that's just more of it's because it's hard to say if you don't do that. And so that's why you get that change that takes place. Or here at the bottom, you have an example from sakar, which means to hire oneself in the hit pile stem, and see how the sin and the tav have switched places there. So you can have metathesis. One other thing that can happen, that is when the first root consonant of the verb is either a dalet, a zayin, a tate, or a tav. If it's one of those 4 letters at the beginning of a word, you have an assimilation of the tav prefix. So the tav prefix shows up as a dagesh forte in the first root consonant. So you actually lose that indication of the hit pile stem. Again, that's if the first root consonant is a dalet, zayin, tate, or tav. And you can see the examples there. And that is it. That is the hit pile stem. And we have finished with the lectures of the first Hebrew primer. Congratulations on making it almost to the very end of the class. We have one more week left where we'll do some more translation.